Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Yes, hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Alderson, with you to talk about, two topics, really, that are sometimes thought of as in contrast, although maybe not necessarily so: education and inequality. The interplay between those two is the subject of the new book, The Education Trap, by Cristina Groeger, and she is an assistant professor of history at Lake Forest College, and with me right here. And Cristina, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I wanted to get in before we started. It's The Education Trap. That's a significant title there, and I wanted to, I guess, first start off with education. There's education like small e, which you'd find in the dictionary, which is like, exchange of information or however you define it. But there's also education with a kind of a big E, systematic and institutionalized education, and the way that we think about education as a society. And I think it's fair to say that this book is a lot about that second definition, as it pertains to a lot of the social issues that you bring up.
Yeah, I think the story that I'm tracing is kind of maybe the transformation from one to the other. So thinking about a time when actually there were lots of different ways of learning. And most of what I'm talking about in the book is learning for work and for jobs. So a lot of different kinds of institutions where you might be learning things in the workplace, in the family, in some schools, but then the movement out of that into a formal educational system in schools, and kind of the significance of that transformation for inequality and work, broadly speaking.
And that's something that certainly is a very interesting concept that I had going into it, because obviously the concept a lot of people have is education solves inequality. That you educate everybody and give people access to an education, and boom, then you're good.
Mm-hmm.
That's I guess kind of true in some senses, and kind of not, as the book details.
Yeah, the idea that education, right, can solve inequality is a very old idea, and there's lots, dating back to the earliest public school reformers and people like Horace Mann that back in the 1840s that were pushing for making more educational opportunities available. I think now that idea is most closely associated with and like promoted by the kind of human capital theory of education that comes out of economics that says, what you are paid in the labor market is sort of based on your skills and productivity that depend on your skill level, how much education that you have. So the best way that we can increase social mobility and increase or reduce inequality is by giving everyone the tools, right, to be able to compete in the labor market and get rewarded for the skill level that they have. And I think I want to show in the book that is not totally untrue. Like that is grounded in historical experience, and I focus especially on the early 20th century when for students entering white collar work, which was like the fastest growing sector of the economy, that really was true. Like schools opened up new networks, gave them access to new skills that allowed them to go into this work that was, preferable employment for them. But that's just one sort of small piece of the story. And along the way, you also see the way that education was used by employers to undercut the power of other kinds of workers, such as craft unions, and then also like higher educational credentials in colleges and universities were then used to really concentrate power and wealth rather than redistribute it. I'm telling kind of a more nuanced story, but one that I think we've focused a lot on that first story and less on some of the other unintended consequences.
So I wanted to ask you first off about the subtitle of your book, which I didn't say before, but it's extremely important, which is Schools and the Remaking of Inequality in Boston. And that remaking of inequality is a really important phrase, and a really great phrase. But also, I want to focus right now on in Boston. It's not just because I'm about an hour outside Boston. This is where I grew up as well. But because I wanted to know why exactly Boston, and what kind of, especially at the start of the period that you're looking at, what kind of inequality was there that needed to be remade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think Boston is a good place to study education and the economy together. The education piece first, I think, because it has such a long and developed history of education, both in terms of having one, at the time period when I start in the late 19th century, one of the most well-developed public educational systems, but also the oldest private institutions and private colleges and universities. So it has a lot of different types of educational institutions. And, if I'm going to make the case of like, what is the effect of education on the economy, it makes sense to pick a place that has where education is kind of the most developed. And then but a number of other features, I think, make Boston in some ways representative of other northern US cities at the time. So it's a center of industry and commerce as a port city. It has a large immigrant population in the period that I'm looking at. And so it has a smaller African-American population, but I think some of the other dynamics of, immigrant ethnic politics in the city, industry, and education together, allow me to kind of look at these interactions in a way that I think does apply to the story of education and inequality in other parts of the northern United States. And on, the remaking of inequality, that's the starting point for that is, I'm not saying that inequality didn't exist and schools, created it out of nothing. I think the kinds of inequalities that existed in Boston in the late 19th century were actually more overt and more clearly. I focus mostly on labor market inequalities. So you have an extremely, segmented labor market where certain types of certain immigrant groups, certain genders are just focused in certain types of industries. And the patterns through which people access work are also very limited. And so the first chapter of the book kind of, sets the scene by talking about all the sort of family and ethnic and racial networks that are really are somewhat informal, but in other ways are actually very rigid, and are ways that people can access employment and limit the ability of mobility, between different sectors of the economy. So low wage workers are largely recent immigrants, African Americans. They're kind of stuck in those positions. And schools offer some ways, in the next chapters, I talk about ways that schools offer some ways of eroding some of those rigid boundaries, but then kind of making new ones.
And that's something that I had never really thought much of, but it really struck me when I was reading. The first thing that you see on a job posting or on a job application is often your education. And it's, you have to have a certain degree, or at least a certain degree level, high school or college. And this is a labor market we're talking about in which it's much more about either your family or a guy or you're in the right stratification. So in one sense, it feels more chaotic. Oh, there's no specific job listing or no specific job requirement, but the job requirement was kind of unsaid. it was that you had to be a certain class and certain race and gender and all that.
Yep. Yeah. And I use newspaper want ads. They weren't the main way that people found work, but they're a good source to give you a clue about the kinds of qualities that actually mattered for employment, from low wage workers up through white collar business leaders or professionals. And I think there you can see that, they might specify age, whether or not you could come with a recommendation, experience, some kinds of skills that you would have learned on the job, race, ethnicity, Protestants only, or a lot of other qualifiers. But education, you hardly ever see education, at least in the 19th century, turn of the 20th century. That really comes a little bit later.
Now, why? I mean, if I'm sitting there in this society, obviously I can see from from somebody who's being marginalized, I can see why that would be a good thing to try to push for education. But overall, what were the factors that led to this quote remaking? Now, we've talked about remaking of inequality, but just the remaking of the educational system and views of education.
Yeah. So I think a number of different factors, and actually, a lot of different constituencies that each kind of had their own reason for promoting education, but that were often different from each other. So I think, so for a lot of working class, or mostly like youth, it was youth who were taking advantage of the school system most of all. And I think for a lot of working class and immigrant youth, schools, especially schools that could offer skills in new white collar work, so new jobs as accountants and bookkeepers and secretaries, typists, that was one of the clearest cases of using schools to access better employment. And so I think there is a strong kind of working class constituency for the expansion of schools. I also talk about, progressive reformers had all kinds of ideas of how schooling was going to solve poverty, right? And this is getting back to like the human capital model of education, but for a lot of them, they thought, the reason that low wage workers were stuck in their jobs was because they didn't have enough skills. And if you could, say for domestic service, if you could train someone to be a very skilled domestic servant, that would kind of elevate the status of their job and the working conditions of their job and make it kind of a respected profession even. That largely fails. I mean, so there's a lot of attempts at promoting education that also don't work out. And I focus on kind of the failure of education for low wage work and for industrial work. I think motivated by ideas that if you could just provide the right skills, then this would sort of transform the occupations that workers were going into. But what ultimately determined whether or not education was successful for these students was kind of the larger political economy that was shaping the status of work. So in industry, there, I think employers are actually very supportive of educational expansion for the most part, both in the private and the public sector, because it means that they don't have to pay for the training of their workers, right? So it's sort of, they were big advocates of industrial training and vocational training, that they also saw as ways to kind of undercut the monopoly of training that craft unions had. So if they could provide, if there were these other schools, providing it for free, then that would save them the costs of training and also allow them to avoid having to employ, a sort of union loyalists in their workplaces. So I think there's a range of constituencies that are pushing for education, and then some experiments in low-wage work and industrial work aren't very successful, whereas I think the big success story is education for white-collar work.
And that was something what you just mentioned was something that was interesting to me, both as alumnus of Carnegie Mellon University, which was one of these universities founded by famous industrialists and meant for the workers, but also because the idea of vocational training is kind of a buzzword. It's kind of something that comes up in modern political discourse when people talk about democratizing access to especially higher education now. And I won't say that you're you don't like it because but you're definitely, I think, a bit more cautious, we'll say, than other people when it comes to recommending, because you've pointed out some of the ways in which it was used, as you say, to undercut the unions when it was brought in at the start of the 20th century.
Yeah, I think it's also a little bit problematic or misleading in the way that people talk about vocational training today, in that it seems like our go-to example is training for like construction work, right? Or like training for more industrial jobs. And I think that's long been in this period. That was also how the rhetoric of vocational training usually meant men's industrial training. Even though I want to argue that actually like white collar business training for women was actually a much more successful kind of vocational education in this period. But anyway, but I think that the story today, that this, the meaning of vocational training still, I think, has that resonance of like, we imagine it to be men's industrial training for the most part. And I think, the story that I want to tell is that this was just like today. There were politicians and employers saying, look at Germany, look at the vocational training of continental Europe. We should expand access to training for the trades, and that will revitalize, well-paying jobs in this period. It was sort of craft worker positions, revitalize the crafts. And I think even some labor unions themselves like saw value in expanding education to more practical subjects. What they didn't like was how employers, right, as I argue, they wanted to use industrial training to undercut craft unions, which depended on control of skill building and the apprenticeship process. And what I find is that actually unions and craft unions, which were strong in Boston, in especially the building and the metal trades, they were pretty successful at limiting the success of industrial training. So they were able to, shut down some private trade schools, shape the public industrial education to be a bit more union friendly, and impose some restrictions. And that's one of the reasons why in the United States, I think industrial training and vocational tracks kind of became like a less successful, mostly like a track for less academically well-performing students, rather than a really successful pathway into industry or jobs in industry, like sort of what happened in other countries, or kind of how it functions in other countries. And what happened in the US instead was that, because of these limits on, these pesky craft unions that kept getting in the way of industrial training, employers pursue mass production strategies that essentially just eliminate craft workers or reduce the proportion of craft workers that they need. So they're essentially getting rid of the jobs that, one might enter into with with sort of real industrial training. And they can do that because they can now rely on white collar workers in growing sort of these sort of large corporate bureaucracies. And then they can rely on sort of factory operatives that can be trained very quickly, don't need a long apprenticeship process, that also don't need like a specialized craft training in schools. They can have kind of basic literacy and numeracy that they can get from public schools and enter these jobs. So it's sort of a two-step process, but I think the reasons for the success of industrial training in places like Germany were also because of a very different political economy that allowed unions and employers and the state to kind of cooperate and create this sort of regulated system of training. But in the US, that never happened. And it's the idea that if you just like expand training for jobs that don't exist, or, you know, a very limited number of good jobs, that's sort of flipping like the causal story. That's not going to bring back, you know, good, well-paying jobs in manufacturing. That story, you know, we've already passed that point.
And that gets to something you mentioned, white collar workers. It gets to something that you kind of flip this on its head a bit. People talk about liberal arts and then vocational training.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked at one point you said that, you know, the liberal arts education, you know, in many ways was designed as an extremely vocational training, and not necessarily just in the way that the skills were, but also in this sense of a pipeline into the white collar job market. So just explain a bit what you mean by that, because it sort of flies against what people normally say when they think vocational training.
Yeah. So I think because of the history of the development of education, right? Like vocational training meant a more sort of more practical skills, was associated with jobs in the trades or with industry. And that was very different than the kind of education one would receive in high school, either as sort of a college preparatory course, or, you know, an academic course in high school, or in the liberal arts in a college. So there's sort of a long history of this division between liberal education and vocational education, and I think that like that division is a sort of across the political spectrum, is used by both the left and the right to make different kinds of arguments, but and like, what is the meaning of liberal education? You know, there's lots of debates on what that is, but I think there's still this sense that, well, it's something that's opposed to just a focus on one's career, or just a focus on, you know, money getting, lowly money getting, or kind of a, I think it's used to sort of, it can be used to denigrate the kinds of education that, you know, are more directly targeting specific types of work. So I really wanted to push back on that, because I think often it, you know, it's a kind of conservative argument, but it really ignores the way that liberal arts education was, especially at a time period like the early 20th century, when very few people went to formal schooling beyond 8th grade. Those who did go into high school or college had access to, you know, they were doing it in order to access some of the few jobs that for which formal education was beneficial. And those were, for liberal arts colleges, those were traditionally the learned professions. And then for high schools in this period, especially, you know, it's entering these new white collar jobs. And of course, the we can talk about the ways that the kinds of skills that you would learn in a English class or a history class, or being able to read and write, right? These were also skills that you would use in a professional context. So I want to push back on the idea that that somehow these kinds of education were free from the labor market, and rather I think it was more that they opened doors to very exclusive positions that were, very privileged positions in the labor market, but still had clear vocational, was still sort of a clear vocational path if we think about education leading to a specific type of job.
And that gets to kind of almost like a moralizing effect or the moralizing concept that people have of education, that education and knowledge and intelligence and so on and so forth is a moral good, and that those who possess it are in some way morally superior to those who don't. And that gets to some of the contrasts that you talk about between how we talk about the education that people get from, say, the high-minded and high society liberal arts schools, and the quote low-skilled labor, and you talk about the transferability of some of the skills that you learn. So fixing a pipe might be something that can't be taken over to carpentry, but writing an essay, the argument goes, can be taken anywhere. And there's that contrast there.
Yes, yeah, and I think this is also, I think, across the political spectrum, the meaning of the sort of moral good is different, but I think right there is a sense that education has value, kind of, for individual growth, for creativity, for self-realization, things that go beyond the labor market. And I think, I totally buy, or like I am in favor of thinking about education in that way as well. But I think when we have an educational system that is so, tied up with our labor markets and sort of the corporate economy, we also have, if so many students are relying on education because they think that this is going to enable them to have a well-paying job, we can't sort of dismiss that vocational role of education. And I argue, that like we need to, in order for education to have any sort of higher purpose or greater purpose, I think we have to like address the real material needs of students first, right? Before we have to ensure that students can access well-paying jobs before we then, say, well, you should be pursuing a kind of education that is unrelated to the labor market. But I also think that the argument that education is this moral good and that it's sort of a measure of one's merit, that's been used to obscure a lot of the ways that higher education actually, doesn't really work like that. And I show through looking at correspondence between university leaders and employers in like facilitating job placements for college graduates. So much of what they are talking about, some of what they're talking about is the skills that college graduates learn that might be applicable to different jobs. But a lot of what they're talking about is like whether this person was popular, what sort of extracurriculars they had, whether they were from a native-born family or whether they were working class or not. So there's the ways that then merit and the status of higher education kind of like covers up the way that elite institutions can be very good at just reproducing other kinds of class and ethnic and racial inequalities rather than, reduce them, which is what the idea of a meritocracy or the idea of merit would suggest.
And that's something that you specifically, you have a chapter on becoming pink collar. We think about, again, education trying to break down certain hierarchies, certain inequalities, and yet we have the white collar jobs, these blue collar jobs, and pink collar jobs, which people I think are getting to understand more and more. They're jobs that are generally filled by women, and they occupy a different space in the labor market, and to be blunt, a space that's just not as well, doesn't have as high a status. And I just found it very interesting how you documented some of the the ways in which education play into that, and actually help sort of send. I think you talk about secretaries and operators and these kinds of things. Send girls into and women into these pink collar professions.
Yeah, and I think it's a good, this like pink collar work is also good at showing just how quickly the labor market is changing, and the status and the working conditions in certain kinds of sectors is also sort of rapidly changing. So at the beginning of this period, there's like a small proportion of white collar workers will say, or people, mostly like apprentices to merchants or businessmen, mostly men who would work as bookkeepers or accountants, but their number is pretty small, and it's still a sort of a relatively high status and well-paying position, because most of these men are going to go on to run the business themselves, or have close ties to business leaders. And in this sort of rapid expansion of corporate bureaucracies, you see, like the huge boom and growth of this sector of work, but it also differentiates very quickly in its own kind of internal hierarchy. And this is also sort of an interesting way that gender factors in, because I want to argue, like, for many women entering a job as a retail worker, a secretary, like this represented social mobility for a lot of women, even though from an employer's perspective, one of the big reasons that they were hiring women to do this kind of work was because they could pay them half as much as what they had been paying men, or it was like they assumed that women were going to be part-time because they would get married in a few years. So kind of both, these jobs represented both social mobility and pride and success for women themselves. But in the overall labor market, this was a way that employers could sort of shift their workforce onto cheaper and less secure employment, because also none of these, or very few of these kind of white collar, and then as they feminized, really became pink collar. We could call them pink collar workers. Like, they didn't have unions, they didn't have a lot of agency or power. So this entire sector kind of differentiates, and the vast majority of workers then are sort of women, working class, second generation immigrants, who are working in sort of the lower ends of bureaucracies. And the former merchant's apprentice is now like a business manager, and those are still kind of the top of this white collar hierarchy, and are still dominated by native-born white men at the top. So there's this sort of shifting sector, or shifting dynamics within the sector of white collar work.
It's kind of a one example and a kind of a microcosm of this whole thing, because it looks in many ways,
Mhm.
and to a certain extent it is, like education is bringing people up, and hey, look, now women in the workforce, this is great.
Right.
Women in white collar jobs where they might have generally been like domestic help before, yet, as you say, obscures a kind of a still same stratification, still kind of patriarchal concepts. And I also had to, had to sort of think when I was reading this, that actually we're talking about all this education, and one of the biggest pink collar jobs there is right now is teacher,
Uh-huh.
and is educator.
Yes.
And that's really been a big part of it.
Yeah, no, and teaching is one of these, I mean, is also interesting in lots of ways, because it was like only ministers, right, also required as much formal education to enter their professions in the start of this period. So like teachers have always had one of the longest like formal education processes to enter their work. But teachers feminized, in the early or mid 19th century, and also had sort of the lowest status of the profession. So they're also a good example, right, to show that like it doesn't, even having a lot of education, and that's not going to ensure anything about like the nature of the work that you do, or
those who
how much.
can't do teach is the
Right.
thing that people always say.
Yeah. So it kind of breaks the equation of like education is going to equal a high status job. But I think the other story is, even in the professionalization of teaching, or efforts to try to improve the status of teachers, and provide more education in this period, like at the college level for teachers. We see a lot of the same dynamics at work within the profession. So you sort of end up with like a more hierarchical profession, where you have sort of women elementary school teachers at the bottom, and then like new types of educational administrators that are mainly white men, at the top, that have a lot of power over the teaching force. So there's in kind of a lot of sectors where, similar to the story of white collar work and the transformation from white collar to pink collar, in a lot of professions, you really, what we're describing, or what we're seeing in like the professionalization of medicine, of law in this period, is actually just sort of creating these like very hierarchical ladders, where one end of the profession is doing really well, usually the ends that are most closely connected with the corporate economy, like corporate lawyers, and then they sort of get further and further apart from the lower ends of the profession, in like trial lawyers or teachers. So that's that story. We can see teachers as a good example of that.
And I apologize, taking it from your, the period of the kind of the early 20th century to now. One of the moderators on Ask Historians, very active on a lot of these issues, and very interested in a lot of these educational issues. But I was talking to her, and she drew a parallel, when talking about that, to the rhetoric around teachers' unions now, and trying to hold teachers unions kind of feet to the fire, especially with the schools reopening, and just the vilification in general of that concept. And was just kind of wondering, how you viewed that, through the lens of a lot of these issues that we're talking about.
I think I think what teachers sort of represent too, or can help us think about, is the way that work that we might think of as sort of professional work, or was one of the oldest professions, that we assume has sort of is not blue collar work, or low wage service work, should be respected, should have autonomy. How a lot of just sort of how occupations can change over time. And I think the fact that teachers are one of the most organized, right, in terms of union representation professions now shows how it's kind of blurring the line between professional work and what we would associate with other sort of working class strategies of organizing, which I think is important because there's nothing about very well educated workers that means that they are actually going to have much power on the job. And I think the fact that teachers unions now can be a really powerful force for defending the qualities of good work for specific occupations, it is important in showing that isn't limited to blue collar work. That's something that all workers need, even extremely educated workers. And I think there's many reasons, including gender and racial dynamics now there's a long history of blaming teachers that reflect basically this sort of hierarchy within the profession and kind of the precarious role that teachers are in. But I think one of the kind of notes that I end on is seeing educators have a particular role to play in showing that breaking this assumption that education equals higher pay, and actually what is really important is the power of workers, how well organized they are, and we're kind of seeing that now in a lot of the reopening debates.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating concept overall. In reading the book, I found that one of the things that just kept sort of coming to my mind time and time again is that education has, you've documented some of the successes in education, but it's also essentially just changing the code. And you mentioned early on in our discussion about the reading the want ads, or how you would go looking for a job then. And maybe it's not coming from a good family now, but maybe it's coming from the right school, or coming, having the right kind of education, not just in terms of the degree, but, from a high status school and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about the remaking of inequality, what are some of the things that you can really point to and say this was remade? This is the inequality that has become remade through this process.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think I think what I see happening, and I'll take, especially what happens with higher education. So for instance, the last chapter focuses on basically the professionalization of business, or how you go from, most business owners do not have a college education, they learn on the job, to basically business management, schools of business management being opened, new college degrees in business, all kind of brand new in this period, and many managers and business owners having a college degree for the first time. And I think that's that kind of this sort of idea of how education can hide the dynamics actually at work. I think there's, on the outside, there is a sense that, for new kinds of managerial strategies, there's a science behind it, this era of scientific management. If we hire business managers and executives that are knowledgeable, they will make better business decisions. So there's sort of this rhetoric of scientific expertise, and even public service, right? Better business management is going to mean less labor conflict. So we need to so that the rationale behind the professionalization of business is that this is actually going to serve the public better. through more enlightened managerial practices. But I think what that hides is the way that now schools, rather than sort of the family or the extended family and through marriage networks of business executives and leaders and elites sort of reproducing themselves, now you get alumni of elite schools as kind of the new surrogate family, as a term that it's been described as. So instead of relying on family networks, you can now rely on these elite school networks, and many of the same people, right, the same characteristics of the graduates as these schools still and these kinds of programs still kind of reproduce older characteristics of elites, but now they have kind of it's under the guise of college degrees and credentials and merit in accessing these kinds of work. So I think that's one way we can think of the remaking is it's not that these what had been sort of overt inequalities in the labor market go away entirely. I mean, I think there are important ways that education does break them down in some cases, but we also see ways that education just becomes sort of a new place where those networks are formed, and where those inequalities now are sort of hidden right under the surface of merit or academic expertise.
It changes the way that we talk about them and the way that we code them, but it doesn't. It can, but doesn't necessarily change them.
Right, right. It's a lot of the same people, yeah, or same families, yeah.
And it is interesting. I mean, I get emails constantly from my alma mater, and it uses that family right in the the emails, generally asking for money. That's which I guess is what family does, right? So well, we've gone through. I want to stress that we've gone through a lot of overviews and a lot of conceptual talking here. There's a lot of really interesting historical examples and charts and figures, and it's a really fascinating book. It is called the Education Trap. It is out now, and you said among many other places to check it out. You can go to tinagroeger.com, which is TinaGroeger.com, which is your website. And otherwise, is there anything else that you'd like to let people know about the book, and give them that sales pitch before they run out and grab it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I want to stress that although I'm making sort of this critical case about education, right? It's not so much that education is a bad thing, or like we shouldn't try to defend education. And actually, I think one of the sub stories is actually how in this period, like public education, or are you still? Yeah, you're still there. Okay. Public education kind of replaces a for-profit sector, like the for-profits of their day, and replaces certain forms of exploitation that can happen in the for-profit sector. So, I think there's an important role for especially public education to play. But the argument is, that it's an insufficient strategy, and more so than just insufficient, I think it can also be a distracting, or it can obscure some of the real, some of the bigger determinants of inequality, like the power of workers on the job. So I'm hoping to kind of walk that fine line of defending education, but also really pointing out some of its limits.
And I'm glad you actually brought that up, because I had it in my notes, and I did want to ask you something that is a very you use the term free public alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions that I had was, how important is each of those? I mean, there's the public alternatives, yes, but also when even, I think a freshman starting at the University of Massachusetts, just down the way from me, still has, even if they get free tuition, you have fees, you have living costs, so on and so forth. Okay,
Yeah.
it's a public institution. If I'm still shelling out 15, 20K a year, where's the balance there, and how has that been managed in, throughout the period you've talked about?
Well, I mean, it's so interesting to be looking at the early 20th century while hearing debates now about student debt and whether we should make college education free, because not only was like public high school, in this period, that was the frontier of the day, right? And making high school a free and accessible service to everybody was kind of the biggest shift. But also, there's so many discussions in Boston and in other places at the time about establishing free public higher education that go back to the 19th century. And actually, in Boston and Massachusetts, leaders point to Western states that had had state universities already, and private universities in Boston actually limit. They basically block a public university from being founded in the city until the mid 20th century. But I think all of the debates, it's sort of this assumed well, of course we have free secondary school, we need to make higher education free to everyone as well. And that's sort of the obvious next step. We see the growth of, even when public institutions are founded, the growth of tuition rates, but yeah, of course, all these other costs. But it's striking to me how sort of obvious it was that well, of course, you would need to have accessible, local higher education institutions that were free in any locality that you could easily commute to make public higher education something accessible to everyone. And we still now it almost seems like we're further away from that now because we're now in a situation where almost no types of education are actually free. So, but I think we can learn from some of these early debates in this time period.
And that's it's the ultimate thing that we learn anytime I do one of these podcasts, anytime anyone posts a question up to Ask Historians. None of this is new. All of this seems to have been talked about.
Exactly.
And talked about again. And we haven't quite gotten that solution yet, I guess, but it's absolutely fascinating to take a look at it. And I think you were right as well to caution that, I may, in some of the questioning and certainly the title itself, the education trap, take a little bit of a negative view of a lot of this, but it's also an overwhelmingly, interesting and positive, concept in many ways. And it's just, I guess would it be fair to say the ways that it's been applied perhaps have not quite been as equal as they could be.
Yeah. And just how it was very hard and almost impossible to really separate out the educational system from the new economy, right? Or the inequalities of the economy around it. Education often reflects what is going on outside of it and grew in this period, in relation to the labor market. So, right, for historical reasons, these two things have often been hard to separate.
I'm just thinking you might get a couple of confused people that think that you're going to do some takedown of the liberal university complex, right, of the education trap. You are pro education ultimately.
Yes. Yep. We'll see. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess it depends on how it's implemented. Well, thank you again, Cristina Groeger, the author of The Education Trap, assistant professor over at Lake Forest College, and a really phenomenal look at the ways in which education not only confronts some of the inequality present, but also, unfortunately, reinforces or at least remakes it in some way. And thank you, Cristina. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And you've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. I am Tyler Alderson, and we'll see you for the next episode.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.